In January 1991, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm, a massive military campaign against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, designed to remove his forces from neighbouring Kuwait. As bombs fell on Baghdad, Americans back home were experiencing the war in a radically new way. Thanks to a news channel called CNN, they could watch the action unfold in front of them, live on TV. CNN became the prime source of news, not simply for the public, but also for the highest reaches of government. If government officials wanted to know what was going on, or where a bomb had landed, they turned on the TV. As President George H.W. Bush reportedly told other world leaders, "I learn more from CNN than I do from the CIA." At the heart of this revolution in news gathering was Ted Turner, the brash, eccentric media mogul who had launched CNN a decade earlier, in 1980, when the idea of a 24-hour news channel seemed absurd to many of his critics. By 1991, however, that gamble had paid off and changed the way the world experienced history.
Welcome to Last Rites. Today we'll be exploring the life of Ted Turner, the media mogul who died in May at the age of 87. And Turner, in many ways, is the archetypal business tycoon. He's incredibly driven, he's restless, he's a megalomaniac, and his private life is incredibly turbulent, marked by affairs and broken marriages. But in other ways, he is completely unique. He pioneers 24/7 cable news, which is this seismic development that completely transforms American politics. To its admirers, cable news offered viewers a way to watch history unfold in real time. But to its critics, cable news is responsible for the political polarization, outrage culture, and rise of populist politics, which is obviously today such a feature of American life. And I think what you think of this debate will ultimately inform what you make of Ted Turner's legacy.
Okay, so we'll get into Turner's legacy a bit later on, but where do you want to begin this story?
Yeah, so I think reading Ted's life and his early childhood, the overwhelming and dominant figure is that of his father, Ed Turner. So it's slightly confusing because it's Ted and Ed. But Ted was born in Cincinnati in 1938. And his father, Ed Turner, was a difficult man. He was an alcoholic, he was unpredictable, he was prone to depression, and he was also a violent man who believed that hardship and pain contributed to making hardy, strong men.
Right. And he also beat Ted as a child, right?
He did. He famously beat Ed with a wire coat hanger. And Ted's first wife later suggested that his father wanted Ted to feel insecure and to feel humiliated because he believed that that sense of insecurity is what would breed greatness and breed this sort of sense that he needed to succeed. So there was a kind of intentionality to the cruelty that he showed towards his children.
Didn't he charge Ted rent when he came back from boarding school?
He did, yeah. So, Ted was shipped away to boarding school as a child. And you're right, when he returned home at summer, he would have to work often for his father in his billboard company, which we'll get onto later. And his father charged him rent, which again was probably one of these efforts to inculcate a sense of adversity or difficulty into his childhood.
Yeah, and presumably they had enough money to not be paid rent. So what impact did this kind of culture of abuse have on Ted in his kind of early years, do you think?
What you see is that in school, he becomes a bit of a menace. He is actually expelled from his elementary school, which if you think about it,
How do you get expelled from your elementary
it's
school?
quite extraordinary. And he's sort of sent away to a series of boarding schools. He's sent to a private boarding school in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And we should say at this point that although he's born in Cincinnati, his father moves the family down to Georgia when he's quite young. So the majority of Ted's childhood is spent in the South at these boarding schools that are obviously all white at this point. And so Ted is a very naughty child. He's constantly getting into trouble. but he also develops this sense of very fierce competitiveness.
From his father, presumably, or from himself? I mean,
Well,
a bit of
from his
both.
father, but he also gets obsessed with these books about great men. So he's reading all about Napoleon, Alexander the Great. You know, he sort of sees himself, I think, in the mold of these figures. One of his favorite films, which comes out when he's quite young, is Citizen Kane, the Orson Welles film of 1941, which is, you know, about a media magnate who becomes fabulously wealthy. And
He
obviously
sort of misunderstands that film, doesn't he?
well, possibly, because obviously the lesson of Citizen Kane is that he is desperately unhappy living in this enormous palatial mansion called Xanadu. And in a way, this is going to become similar to Ted's
So there's
life
an irony to that. He didn't know that was
later
the
on.
lesson at first.
I think the Gen Z phrase is manifesting. So it's that Ted Turner is manifesting
Very down with
his
the kids,
life as Citizen Kane.
Moving on the story, he goes to university, he goes to Brown, and this sense of belligerence and troublemaking kind of continues there. But it takes on a darker tone. So in his biography by Gerald and Robert Goldberg, we are told that he kind of goes out of his way to provoke his fellow classmates. And former students describe him singing Nazi songs outside a Jewish fraternity house and placing Ku Klux Klan signs on the dorm rooms of Black students. So very troubling things at this early stage.
Yeah, and it's probably worth just pulling back a bit to think about the context of the 1950s. Ted has grown up in the South for much of his childhood, and this means that he's attended segregated all-white schools across the South, in Tennessee especially. In 1954, there is the great Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education, which outlaws segregation in schools and universities and really kicks off the modern civil rights movement. But Ted's really grown up in the world before that, so in this world of all-white Southern education. And I think there is possibly this sense when he moves from the South to the North to attend Brown University, which is in Rhode Island, where he is kind of playing up his Southern, you know, frankly, racist views that he's learned in his childhood. And throughout Turner's life, I think that upbringing does shape his views on race. There are multiple instances later on in life when he is caught saying racist or anti-Semitic things. And at the time, it's sometimes sort of laughed off. He's called, it's the mouth of the South.
The mouth of the South,
Is his great name. But obviously reading it today, it has a slightly more...
troubling undertones.
Exactly.
And it also shows his instinct to be controversial, right? Which we'll see develop in his success as a media mogul. But when he's eventually thrown out of Brown, as he had been from his elementary school, so there's a pattern there. It's not actually for racism; it's because he's found in bed with a woman in his dorm room,
which is obviously another great theme of his life.
Which is another great theme of his life. He's a great womanizer. So he finds himself at a loose end. He sort of bums around a bit and then goes home to Georgia to work for his father's billboard company, which his dad had set up in the late 1930s. And by the 50s, it was doing quite well. So he had expanded aggressively across the South. But to fund that, he had taken on large debts. And these debts would lead to his father, Ed, drinking heavily and to periods of depression. And in 1963, he shot himself, Ted's dad, Ed, which would be an incredibly important and pivotal moment in Ted's life, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Ted is only 24 when his father kills himself. And for all of the violence and cruelty in that relationship, Ted had an enormous amount of respect for his father.
And desire for approval, right?
And desire for approval. And he effectively spends the rest of his life trying to impress his father or the memory of his father. And in a way, I think that's possibly one of the reasons why he is so relentlessly ambitious, because there is this sense that he's never able to gain the approval of his father, not least because of his father's early death. And what we see happen after his father kills himself, and this happens frequently throughout Ted's life, is that Ted channels the sort of grief and pain that he feels in the aftermath into ambition. And of course, the irony, if that's the right word, of this is sort of exactly how his father saw success as occurring, which is through pain and through struggle.
So, against most advice, Ted fought to prevent the sell-off of his father's billboard company, and he takes control of it himself. And he actually turns out to be very good at the billboard business. He kind of stabilizes it and expands it beyond billboards into radio and TV, right?
Yeah, so in 1970, he buys a small, failing Atlanta television station, which he renamed WTCG, but which is commonly known as Channel 17. And I think what he's looking for with his expanding business is what's sometimes called synergy. So when the different parts of the business improve other parts of the business. So his billboards could advertise his media properties, and his media properties could increase the value of his advertising empire.
Okay, but the Atlanta TV station is actually in quite a sorry state, and he kind of manages to turn it around, right?
Yeah, I mean, Channel 17 was losing money, and Turner didn't really have the resources to provide much original programming. So what he does is basically to fill the airwaves with very cheap material, old movies, reruns of old television shows, sports fixtures, anything that keeps the viewers engaged. He purchases a baseball team called the Atlanta Braves, and he puts all of their matches on TV. So he's basically trying to fill his schedule with a lot of cheap content that will just keep people engaged. He also doesn't understand why the channel has to stop broadcasting at night.
Because he's also an insomniac, right? So is there a personal element to that?
There is. So what used to happen on TV is that, I'm not sure exactly what the time, but sort of towards late evening, an American flag would appear on the screen and play the national anthem, and then the whole thing would be turned off for the night. And as you said, Turner is an insomniac, and he doesn't understand why people can't sit up all night watching TV.
Yeah.
So he starts to push the channel towards round-the-clock broadcasting. And it's one of the first stations to operate 24 hours a day. So this is quite a big innovation that obviously is going to prefigure what he's doing with CNN. The other thing that he starts to do, which is quite innovative, is he starts sending the signal of his local station to satellites in space, which can then beam that signal all across the nation. So this originally small Channel 17 station in Atlanta, because of this new satellite technology, is able to be broadcast all across America.
Hey, look at us. We're the Superstation, WTCG Atlanta.
Hey, look at us.
Okay, and I think for listeners, it's worth explaining a little bit about how American television works at this time.
Yeah, so television, and especially television news, is dominated by three major broadcast networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC. And these are broadcast all across America. And the main event of those channels was the evening news. This was usually a half an hour long event. It comes once a day, and it's fronted by these sort of famous figures in American news reading, the most famous of which is Walter Cronkite, who is the one who very famously and very emotionally is the one who announces Kennedy's assassination.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And these channels and these anchors basically have enormous authority over American television and American news. They essentially decide what is the news and how Americans understood the events of the day. But as we said, it is this half an hour, very limited show that happens once a day. Now, by the 1970s, this system is coming under increased criticism, especially from the resurgent political right.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon, who is now president, hates this aspect of the media. He sees these three broadcasters as dominated by liberal elites who are hostile to him in particular and to conservatism more generally. And he and his vice president, Spiro Agnew, rail against what they see as elite liberal dominance of the media, which is obviously...
Which is very prevalent today, right?
Exactly.
Well, they have much more power than most people would like to think. When we think of the media in this country, the problem is that they have a sense of self-righteousness, a double standard on issue after issue after issue. They can find everything wrong with somebody else, but they will not look inside and ever admit that they could be wrong themselves.
But at this time, there is a new technology that is emerging, which is cable television.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about what cable is, because this is all we want to be as clear as possible, right?
Yeah, so cable originally develops as a way to just get TV signal to places that are quite out the way, rural areas that aren't picking up signal very well. So what you would do is you would set up a tall tower, which would pick up the main broadcast signal, and then you'd run a wire to the houses to get better reception. But what people essentially realize is that you don't need to show the main broadcast networks, and you can have cable only channels as well. And Nixon and his government get very excited about this development because they basically see cable television as an alternative to the main big networks, which
he sees as liberal elites. Okay.
Exactly. So there's a number of reforms that take place in the 1970s under Nixon and then later under Ford and Carter, which essentially loosen the regulations on cable television and allow these networks to begin to grow.
Okay, so presumably this provides the context for Turner building CNN.
Exactly. And I think this is the bit of the story that is most fascinating, because today CNN is very associated with the liberal
Yeah, I
left.
found this bit fascinating. Completely does an about turn, right?
Exactly. I mean, today Trump is the one who's always railing against CNN, etc. But it's very much the reforms of the Nixon administration which are designed to break the kind of liberal dominance of the broadcast networks, which provides the opportunity for Turner to start CNN. He very much sees himself and presents himself as an outsider battling the liberal network establishment. He is by no stretch of the imagination a liberal. So it's one of the great ironies, I think, of the origins of CNN is, even though today it is a liberal network, it very much emerged out of this moment when the right was trying to break the dominance of these liberal networks.
Okay, so cable TV is expanding and Turner's Atlanta station is doing very well. And it is at this point that he decides that he wants to start a new cable channel that will broadcast news all day. And it's funny at this point because he doesn't even like news that much. He finds it, rather boring and very, very serious. And he famously says that no news is good news. So, I mean, why is it that he wants to start this news channel?
I think it's partly because he sees lots of money to be made in it.
Yeah.
There are lots of upsides to news as a way of doing TV. It's pretty cheap. There are no copyright issues in the same way there are with old films. And thirdly, and this is Turner's great innovation, he saw how news had the ability to be limitless and continuous.
Okay.
And by that, I essentially mean that he thought that news could be broadcast all day and there could actually never be an end to the news. Now, previously, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's this sense that the news comes on at 6 o'clock for half an hour and there is a finite amount of news in the day, which will be reported for about half an hour. And so industry insiders, when Turner is floating this idea, are questioning, how are you going to have a 24/7 news show? Like, what are you going to show when there is no news?
And of course, his answer is that, there's always news somewhere, right? In a way that we now have grown accustomed to in the way we consume news. There is always something happening, whether it's a foreign war or whether it's domestic. So he kind of catches this idea and builds it into what will become CNN.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's not just that they're going all around the world for their news. I mean, obviously something will be happening somewhere always, but it's that he also decides that you can actually create news when there is no news. You can do interviews, you can cover press conferences, you can do features.
So this reminds me of a concept called pseudo-events, which comes from Daniel Boorstin's 1962 book, The Image. So the idea is that news is actually a kind of carefully curated, carefully choreographed spectacle, and that the media itself actually creates the news.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the modern parallel is probably when Trump's press secretary does these press conferences where essentially news is created by the fact that there is an interview going on.
Yeah.
So the gathering of the news becomes the news itself, if that makes sense. And of course, Boorstin is writing in 62, so in the context of the Kennedy presidency, when these kind of carefully choreographed media spectacles are becoming much more of a feature of American life. But you're right, essentially the way that CNN is going to work is by using these kind of pseudo events to create news all of the time.
This news service will be called the Cable News Network and will program continually updated half-hour segments of national news, business news, sports, and features 24 hours a day.
So CNN launches in 1980, and at first it's widely ridiculed. So critics call it the chicken noodle networks, the idea that it's small time, low quality, underfunded. Its audience is tiny compared to the other major networks, and it has technical problems live on air. So at one point, a presenter's bin is emptied by a cleaner live on air accidentally.
Yeah, I mean, when we're reading about the first early days of CNN, it reminds me of when GB News started, and for its big splashy opening, Andrew Neil was reporting from what looked like a sort of hostage situation.
But like GB News, I suppose, it gradually expands. And in a sense, it's benefiting from Turner's own celebrity at this point. So a year earlier, he won the America's Cup, which is a very prestigious sailing race. He's been sailing since childhood. But I suppose it also grows because of the product. I mean, CNN is a good product.
Yeah, I think it benefits from the fact that this is the 1980s and into the 1990s. You know, it's a period rich in history, if that doesn't sound too weird. I mean, this is the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, of Tiananmen Square protests in China.
The Challenger disaster. The hearings between Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, Supreme Court Justice. Yeah.
And then the trial of O.J. Simpson as well in the 1990s. But the main event that really puts CNN on the map is the Gulf War, which we mentioned in the intro. The Gulf War completely transforms CNN's importance. You know, the bombing of Baghdad begins in 1991, and CNN have correspondents in the city while many other networks are forced out or dependent on official briefings. And so CNN are really like at the front line of this war. And if you watch the clips online, I mean, it's incredibly striking to see this war play out live in real time. And the network's Gulf War coverage won them the Peabody Award, which is this prestigious award. It transforms CNN into a real international institution. And in 1992, Turner appears on the cover of Time as the Man of the Year for 1991. So it's this really big moment for him.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a sense that, you know, people in the White House, the Vatican, Iraq, homes across the world could watch the same images and hear the same reports at the same time. So it's becoming a kind of strategic actor as well as a news outlet.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, lots of diplomacy begins to be conducted via CNN, you know, world leaders going on CNN, giving interviews, giving press conferences, things like that.
And leaders are watching it.
And I think this is the kind of moment in CNN's history where it seems to have fulfilled the original aim of Turner, which is that CNN is going to create a more well-informed citizenry. It's going to democratize information, and it's going to include people in the great drama of history in a way where previously it was restricted to elites or policymakers. So I think the Gulf War is really the moment where it seems like his vision is coming to fruition.
Yeah. And I mean, parallel to this, he's also ruthlessly expanding his business empire. We shouldn't forget that he is a business tycoon in the same way that Rupert Murdoch was and is with his media empire. There's a sense that, you know, the power and money which comes from building your empire is just as important as Turner's wish to kind of broadcast news to, you know, democratically to the world. So he acquires the entirety of MGM's back catalogue for an enormous cost. And at first, this seems like a disastrous move. And he really pisses everyone off by colorizing old black and white movies.
But this was a shrewd move in the end. He does have this huge catalogue of MGM films that he can use as programming for a new channel that he sets up called Turner Classic Movies, or TCM. And again, this is another example of Turner taking content that other people see as old or useless, repackaging it and using it to fill his schedules. He does this as well in 1991 when he sets up Cartoon Network, which, you know, listeners today will be familiar with. He buys characters including the Flintstones and Yogi Bear and spins that out into a new Cartoon Network that becomes phenomenally successful.
Yeah, so this is a really prosperous period for him. But what I think is really interesting about Ted Turner's life is that it is marked by contradiction, right? So at the same time that he is rapidly expanding his business empire, he's becoming a little bit more tame. So we've seen the kind of controversial, brazen nature of his earlier years. And when he marries Jane Fonda in 1991, he kind of softens a bit, right?
Yeah, so Jane Fonda is his third wife. And the pair really fascinate the public because in a way they feel completely mismatched.
Yeah.
Turner has been a conservative, a hunter, a womanizer, kind of business buccaneer. And Fonda is a feminist, environmentalist, left-wing activist who, you know, was vilified as Hanoi Jane for her opposition to the Vietnam War in the 1970s. But they also share great emotional similarities. Both were children of suicidal parents. Both had grown up seeking approval from powerful fathers. And as you say, I think it's during this period that Turner begins to soften.
Yeah, and he had already begun psychiatric treatment and he begins taking lithium for these long periods of depression, which people close to him say are stabilizing his moods. And I think Jane Fonda has a massive impact on this softening of Ted Turner because she encourages his interest in environmentalism and philanthropy and sort of global causes. Their marriage does eventually dissolve in 2001 after 10 years, partly because of his infidelity, and that's a pattern in his life. He often cheats on his wives. And also her turn towards Christianity.
Yeah, so his marriage comes to an end in the early 2000s. And it's at this point as well that he's beginning to lose control over his media empire. So, you know, the media business is very much in flux at this point. The scrappy world of the 1970s and 80s that allowed Turner to take on the giants of network broadcasting is now becoming a world of big media conglomerates. And in order to keep up with this shifting media environment, Turner Broadcasting is merged with Time Warner in 1995. And this brings Turner fabulous wealth, but he trades that wealth effectively for control over his business. He has this position of vice chairman, but he has much less authority and say over the business. And this is something that deepens in 2001, where there is a further merger between Time Warner and AOL that not only reduces his control further, but also financially leads to huge losses for him. So this final merger essentially takes control of CNN, his other channels, out of his hands. And I suppose the irony is that Turner began life as this scrappy outsider challenger. And by this point, CNN has become firmly ensconced in the media establishment, and it has now become part of the establishment that initially it was set up to challenge.
Okay, so if CNN has taken on this sort of liberal role, who's filled the spot of CNN? Is it Fox News?
Exactly. And, so we haven't really mentioned Fox News yet, but it is the kind of elephant in the room of this episode. Fox begins in 1996 under, obviously, Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes. And it presents itself as the conservative challenger to this kind of calcified liberal media establishment. So in a way, it's sort of reprising the role that Ted Turner had in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
But maybe worst of all, in my view, is the behavior revealed of CNN, where apparently producers solicited questions from the Clinton campaign that a couple of their anchors were thinking about asking Donald Trump.
It's obviously similar to CNN. It's cable, it's 24/7 news, it's outrage, it's all the rest of it. But it's very much coming from obviously the much more conservative perspective.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Last Rites. Join us next week where we will be looking at another fascinating life.